Hello and welcome to Straight Talk. I'm Ayşe Süberker. 70 years ago, a transatlantic alliance was formed to bolster the security of Europe and to advance a common set of values. Values that were based on a sense of collective security and coming to a fellow member's defense. But fast forward several decades, fears are growing that the NATO alliance is drifting away from the core principles that were central to its establishment. That is the feeling coming out of Ankara, which has criticized fellow NATO members for ignoring Turkey's national security concerns. Chief among them has been threats posed by terrorist groups along its border with Syria. The RA is just the latest sticking point in a series of differences that has divided the 7-decade-old alliance. But what's fueling this disconnect? Are some NATO countries changing their view about Turkey's strategic importance? Has Turkey drifted away from the alliance, as some members claim? Or has NATO itself outgrown its original mandate and is now in need of drastic change to fit a different world? And to answer that, joining me now is Mustafa Kibaroglu, who is the Dean of the Faculty of Economics, Administrative and Social Sciences at MEF University, and Tudor Onea, who is an Assistant Professor of International Relations at Bilkent University. Gentlemen, welcome to Straight Talk. It's good to have you here. So 70 years on, the North Atlantic Alliance is under incredible pressure, and some critics say it is unable to maintain its cohesion and its days are numbered. Mustafa, do you agree?
I disagree because NATO was established 70 years ago against threats posed by outside powers on the Western lifestyle, which was and still is liberal democracies, open market economy. So Western lifestyle was under the pressure of and threat of the Soviet Union. Although there is no mention anywhere in the Washington Treaty, which established North Atlantic Treaty Organization, of about any country, but the Soviet Union was clearly the threat. But after the Soviet Union collapsed, the threat was transformed, and therefore uncertainties and local conflicts and international terrorism, global terrorism. So NATO had to transform itself, and one of the major command posts of NATO is in Norfolk, NATO Command of Transformation, so Allied Command Transformation. So therefore NATO adapts itself to the new challenges, and therefore I think so long as there is a threat out there.
Has it been successful in adapting itself to the current?
Well, it's very difficult to measure success because you only know when you're not successful. And to the extent that we know, and from information coming out of several sources, it's possible to say that NATO has been successful in at least deterring some of the countries that will pose challenge to the West, and also fighting effectively against international terrorism.
So, Tudor, do you agree? And what has NATO achieved so far in its 70 years of existence? Give us a general picture.
Well, if you want the short story, Lord Ismay, who was the first secretary of NATO, actually came up with a very famous agenda for the organization. Its goals were to keep the Russians out, to keep the Germans down, and to keep the Americans in. And on all of these fronts, I would say that NATO has succeeded, right? The Soviet Union hasn't invaded. In fact, it has gone out of business. Germany has transformed itself, and the United States is still committed to the alliance. Now, despite what President Macron might say, and even, you know, his comments can be, well, I mean, they have to be interpreted.
Let me touch on that, because lately what has been dominating the pact is these discrepancies among its allies. As you just mentioned, Macron called NATO brain dead, and uncharacteristically, German Chancellor Angela Merkel was very furious, and she said it is essential to preserve NATO. And we also know that there are more deep-seated problems within the NATO. It just became more apparent when Trump took office. So how did NATO get here?
I could say that these discrepancies have always been there. There was always a divide between both sides of the Atlantic, especially the Western European allies have always feared that the United States would not risk its own cities for the European cities, because in case a war started on the continent by an assault from the Warsaw Pact, they thought that the Americans would not like this to escalate into a major warfare exchange between the two superpowers, and they would therefore like to limit the war on the continent. And of course, destruction would have been on the continent. So, but Americans never been successful to some extent to convince the Europeans that they will be there for them all the time, and therefore they sent 300,000 troops to Europe, whose lives would be at risk in case Warsaw Pact attacks. So therefore, I mean, European fears have always been there and will always be there because it's security business. You cannot provide 100% assurances in a way.
Right after Macron's statement, U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo made another statement. Let me quote, NATO must grow and change or risk becoming obsolete. So do you believe some NATO members have different plans when it comes to reforming the alliance itself?
Very, very much so, and I believe this also explains Macron's comments. What is going on, and first of all, what does he mean when he says that NATO is brain dead? One aide to Macron explained the metaphor.
He actually targeted the United States.
The body means the NATO forces. The heart, it's Article 5. Both of these are still working, but the brain is the United States. So what this is in fact a French bid for leadership. Why is this happening now? Because fundamentally France wants essentially a different relation between Europe and the United States. It wants an independent, a strategically independent Europe, but it would be headed itself.
Yes, but on the other hand, Merkel says Europe cannot defend itself on its own. That's why it needs Europe. Do you agree that?
Well,
NATO, excuse me.
Yeah, actually, European security defense policy has still been underway for the last 20 to 25 years, and they have not been able to put together something meaningful. But I have two major criticisms against what Macron said. One, France is the last country to complain about this because France has long been out of NATO's military wing throughout the Cold War years, and they have never participated in NATO planning committees. And secondly, I think Macron aims at putting Turkey on target during the NATO summit in London. So because Turkey, France has done the same thing under Sarkozy back in 2010, and when there was this talk about missile shield, and he propagated views that Turkey was against the missile shield, which was not correct. So this is a typical French president's behavior.
Yeah. Now, according to some NATO members, as you just mentioned, Turkey is not complying with the alliance's principles. It is shifting away from the alliance. Some circles even question its reliability as a partner. So now let's take a quick look at Turkey's history within the alliance, its importance, and we're going to talk about its expectations. So we know most of today's discussions stem from Turkey's Peace Spring operation into northern Syria. European partners complain neither Turkey nor the United States consulted them before launching this operation. But how valuable it is to the alliance in security climate, Tudor? I'm talking about Turkey.
Well, to tell you the truth, it's a little bit France. It's an issue that France is using in order to advance its agenda. And in fact, what I wanted to say before is that right now what is happening is that with the Brexit and with Angela Merkel retiring next year, there is, an opportunity for France to make finally a bid for, for leadership, because it can still act, it can It can speak for Europe, right? And therefore, what Macron did throughout this year has to take, he took a number of initiatives, putting pressure on his European partners to fall into line. A lot of issues on which it isn't necessary to imagine that France really had a stake on them, but he used these issues as bargaining tools. North Macedonia, the delaying of Brexit, rehabilitating Russia, and finally, this is, I believe, the latest issue. It's not necessarily that he cares so much about what is going on in the Middle East, in Syria, but he wants to use this in order to sort of claim leadership for France, and in so doing, prestige and influence.
Now Turkey has taken it to further and asked NATO to recognize PKK's offshoot YPG as terrorists, and otherwise it will hold up defense plans for the Baltics. What do you make of it? Because Çavuşoğlu, after criticism, said, "We're not against NATO's retaliation plans for the Baltic nations, but NATO should also want for Turkey what it wants for the Baltic."
Well, of course, we all know that NATO acts with a unanimity of votes, and if one of the countries out of the members disagrees with the rest, there is no decision taken. So Turkey has always this veto power. If and when necessary, it can use it. But of course, NATO coherence requires that every country should see issues from the same perspective and to be on the same page. And we should definitely do our best to tell and convince our friends that YPG, PKK, are source of threat, and that also fits perfectly well with Article 5 in the Washington Treaty, because this is an armed attack from outside.
Yes.
So there is no sort of a question about that.
So, but why do you think Turkey's security concerns are not reciprocated by its allies? Because we see NATO members, I mean, they're quite adamant in defending the Baltic borders, but on the other hand, they just remain silent when Turkey raises its security concerns.
I believe that what Turkey is after is not necessarily any sort of military help or political or diplomatic help from NATO right now. In fact, I think in October, Turkey showed that it can handle the IPG just very well by itself, right? It doesn't need anyone to hold its hand in doing this. What it really wants is a condemnation of the IPG as a terrorist organization by its partners. And of course, the one state that is very reluctant in doing this is the United States, which is still in league, which is still cooperating with the IPG and is still providing it with aid. So what ultimately is at stake here? Turkey wants this aid to cease or to be, or in any case, to be massively reduced.
So why there's this huge gap of trust?
Well, actually, this is because of different perspectives. Although NATO is an international organization and which is there to protect every member's interest, but most of the members are looking at the issues from their own national security perspective. And this has been so throughout the years. And they told us during the Cold War years, especially Western European allies in NATO, told us not to get involved in any conflict in the Middle East, and they would not be there for us. And they would protect us only against the Soviet Union and also against the Warsaw Pact. And that's why Turkey had to deploy its troops toward the Soviet border and attracting the Soviet threat onto itself by by risking its own devastation. And therefore, Turkey has a lot throughout the Cold War years and afterwards in peace operations for NATO. And it's time for Turkey to at least, expect some payback.
Yeah, sure. U.S. Secretary of State also points to security threats now again from Russia, China, and Iran. So who is to benefit from this skirmish if allies fail to come together and agree on a shared vision?
Well, in the words of a commentator, this would be like champagne on ice for Russia. Why? Because, of course, if NATO is disunited, if there is dissension, if there is quarreling inside NATO, NATO is weak. And therefore, NATO cannot act to block an increase in Russian influence in the former Soviet space, the Baltics, but also towards Eastern Europe, Poland, and of course, the elephant in the room, the Ukraine.
All right, I'm afraid we're out of time, gentlemen. Thank you very much for joining me on Straight Talk. Appreciate it a lot. The plight of Syrian refugees has been a major sticking point between Turkey and its European partners. Promises of several $billions to help with the cost of hosting more than 3.5 million Syrians in Turkey have failed to materialize. Turkey, having already spent $40 billion, has long called on Europe to do more. Having signed a migrant deal with the EU back in 2016, the flow of refugees dramatically decreased. But the cost of protecting Europe's borders was put squarely on Turkey. 6 billion euros were promised to shoulder some of that cost, but less than half of that has actually been delivered to Turkey. Unwilling to wait for others, Turkey acted on its own to provide a long-term solution to the refugee crisis. And that came with the Operation Peace Spring and the establishment of a safe zone in northern Syria, where millions of refugees could return to. But Europe, unwilling to search for its own solution, was dissatisfied with this plan as well. So will the refugee issue become a permanent hurdle between Turkey and the European Union? And joining me now is Jasmine el Gamal, who is a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, and Deniz Sert, who is an associate professor of international relations at Ozyegin University. Ladies, welcome to Straight Talk. It's good to have you here. So, migration deal signed in 2016 dramatically decreased the number of refugees trying to cross to Europe via Aegean and Greece, but it didn't solve the essence of the problem. At least it seems like that. So, Jasmine, what's next for the Turkey-EU deal, and was it a short-sighted deal?
I think that there were a lot of details that weren't discussed in the deal, and namely, one of those details is it going to be safe for refugees to go back to Syria in the near future? I think that this deal was banking on the fact that it would be at some point safe in the near future to go back, and both countries were moving towards that. The problem is that we've gotten to a point today where it doesn't appear safe for refugees to go back to Syria. At the same time, the European Union...
So you mean this 2016 agreement is not working?
I think it's not working. I think there needs to be more attention paid to the conditions on the ground in Syria, and more conversations that are taking that into account, both between the EU and Turkey, not just within each party. They need to be talking to each other about how to make this work.
Right after the launch of Turkey's long-planned cross-border operation, Peace Spring operation, if I'm not mistaken, Juncker demanded an immediate halt and said the bloc will not be paying for this, as it calls, so-called safe zone. So do you believe there's a room for cooperation in the coming future? Because Turkish President Erdogan calls for an international donors conference for the safe zone. What do you make of it?
Well, I think both sides have to first stop this blaming game, and they have to stop turning the refugees into like a foreign policy tool. Because, every time they're discussing this issue, they are discussing only over the numbers, but they're forgetting that we are talking about human beings. About the deal, if you ask the Turkish government, the deal is working, but the European Union is not actually taking on all of its responsibilities because the funds are not received. Not all the funds are received. I have many objections to that as well. But the conditions, in my opinion, also the deal is not working because the conditions on the Greek islands are horrible.
Especially on Moria, right?
Especially on Moria. Also in Kos. Kos is, for example, one of the best cases if you compare to different Greek islands. I was in Kos in May, and the capacity of the camps in Kos was 800 people, and there were already 1,300 in May.
Wow.
Since then, we all know that the numbers have substantially increased. 50,000 people are crossing. So it shows us, it is hinting us the deal is not working in the sense that more and more people seem to be trying to cross right now.
So what should be done next? What does Europe want? They apparently, from Turkey's standpoint, are not sharing the burden of the refugees. It doesn't want this safe zone. So what should be done, Jasmine? Is there a coherent policy of the European Union, or every single country acts on its own?
I think, as you said, there is no coherent EU-wide policy on this. Every country has its different capacities and different thresholds and different public sentiments about refugees that they have to acknowledge in their decision-making. But the one thing that is sort of a positive sign in all of this, or a positive issue, is that all parties, I think, agree on the basic premise that Syrian refugees should be able to go home at some point in a way that is safe and dignified and that doesn't put them and their families into danger. And so if both Turkey and the EU can work from that commonality, which is how do we get them back home safely? What are the things that we need to do? Then all of a sudden it turns from a blame game between Turkey and the EU to working together to address the issues that are making it difficult or unsafe for the refugees to go home, including conditions in the so-called safe zone, including the fact that the Assad regime, which is the major problem and the problem that created this refugee crisis in the first place, is still there.
Is this true that the European Union withholds reconstruction funds so as to push the regime to have some kind of genuine political transition? Is this true?
That is the policy of the EU. That policy is that there will be no reconstruction funds if there is not a genuine political transition that is led by the Syrian people.
Thinking that such move would legitimize the regime, because on the other hand, this current manner could hamper economic recovery and leave Syrians in an enduring need.
It's a really tough conundrum, but if you look at the way reconstruction, and I've written about this a bit, if you look at the way that any reconstruction funds that have gone to Syria are being used, they're being used by the regime to reward people that have supported it, to push refugees from coming back to their original homes.
They are doing demographic engineering
right.
with the reconstruction funds received from the donors. I mean, there is lots of criticism.
We're talking about the European Union.
Yeah. I mean, in general, about all the reconstruction funds, actually.
The EU has not given major reconstruction funds, but there have been some humanitarian assistance that has been provided. They call it early recovery, and mostly for communities to kind of just bare
like
minimum
cosmetic.
More just like basic necessities, not large-scale reconstruction projects. Those projects, because they would actually benefit the regime and allow the regime to sort of claim victory and normalcy, are being withheld in exchange for a political transition.
So in the first phase, Turkey wants 300,000 Kurds to go back to the safe zone, which they came from. Deniz, if the situation stabilizes and the safe zone is able to provide some kind of a safe environment, would the European Union change its stance?
Well, I mean, I think the European Union should start discussing the changing of stance, because whether the EU likes it or not, there will be a zone. I mean, there's already a zone. The question is whether it is safe or not. So to be able to monitor the safety conditions of this zone, the EU has to find a way of collaboration with the Turkish government, because otherwise nobody has access to what's happening in this place. I mean, as an academic, I don't have access. Most of the journalists don't have access. Civil society organizations, human rights organizations don't have access. So to be able to actually figure out
see the ground.
exactly what's going on the ground, they have to find a way of collaboration, a way of monitoring what's going on in this space.
And I think there's another important actor here, just to build on that, because the EU follows UNHCR's policy when it comes to refugee return. So as long as UNHCR has not classified this area or any area in Syria as safe for large-scale, massive returns, then the EU will not support it. So it actually is in favor, or it works for both parties as well, again, both Turkey and the EU, to work with UNHCR to first create the conditions for a safe return on the ground, and that falls a lot more on the Turkish government, obviously.
Is there a will in this respect, do you believe?
From the Syrian side?
Both sides, from Syrian side, from Turkey, from the European Union. Do they favor this?
Question.
Well, just like, when we talk about the European Union, we keep on saying that it is not a homogeneous unit. There are 28 member states, like all these different interests. I think it is the same with the people as well. I mean, there are 3.7 million Syrians who are currently registered under the temporary protection regime in Turkey. Not all of them have the same interests, and not all of them are coming from the same region. I mean, basically, if you are coming from Aleppo, I mean, if Aleppo was home for you, why would you end up going to this safe zone? Actually, I mean, why would you consider it as a home to go back?
Turkey, on the other hand, says, I mean, they'll go voluntarily. We won't be forcing them, right?
I mean,
Right, but that's
Right.
hard to believe. I mean, that's hard to believe. You know, people, Syrians have themselves, many of them who have been interviewed and have said that they want to go back home. And, you know, refugee return policy, international law dictates that everybody should have the right to go home to where they came from. And so I think it is a bit of a tough sell to have Syrians go back, like you said, to some other village where they've never been in their lives, if this is where they're from, Aleppo or any other city. So it's really complicated. I think your point about the will, I mean, is there a political will to actually solve the refugee crisis?
We'll see that.
We'll see that.
All right, ladies, I'm afraid we're out of time. Thank you very much for
Thank
joining
you.
me on Straight Talk.
Thank you.
And that's all for this edition of Straight Talk with me, Ayşe Süberker. If you've got any comments, do share them with us on Twitter with the hashtag Straight Talk. Also, don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Until next time, take care and goodbye.